The night before my scholarship interview felt surreal, like teetering on the edge of a long-awaited escape. I had packed my suitcase with meticulous care, triple-checking every single item. Clothes were folded with sharp, clean lines, my documents organized in a neat folder, and my phone charger coiled precisely. I could almost taste freedom. The room was dim, illuminated by a soft lamp glow, casting long shadows that felt oddly comforting. I couldn't help but glance at my passport drawer one more time. It was locked, exactly how I'd left it. A sense of security washed over me. I would be out by dawn, on the bus to the city, and finally away from this suffocating house. But sleep never came. I lay awake, heart thudding against my ribs. I was so close. Too close. A part of me kept imagining something going wrong. I pushed the thought away, blaming the anxiety on years of living under her roof. When the first light crept through the curtains, I sat up and reached for my suitcase. Everything was still in place. I allowed myself a small, hopeful smile and crossed the room to unlock the drawer. It was ajar. A cold shiver prickled down my spine. My hands fumbled, yanking the drawer open, scattering its contents. Papers, an old necklace, a folded letter from my late mother. All there. But my passport. Gone. I tore through the room, every possible hiding spot, every crevice. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out rational thought. I ripped the bedding apart, upended the closet, checked my bag for the 5th time. Nothing. And then I heard it, a soft, self-satisfied chuckle from the doorway. My stepmother leaned against the frame, swirling a glass of red wine, eyes gleaming, with twisted amusement. "Looking for something, dear?" she purred, taking a long, leisurely sip. My throat tightened, choking on words that wouldn't come. "Where is it?" I finally forced out. She sauntered into the room, brushing past, me to sit on my bed, eyes never leaving mine. "Seems like you'll be staying home after all. Can't go anywhere without proper identification, can you?" Her smile was wicked, full of triumph. I wanted to scream, cry, tear the house apart, but something inside me refused to break in front of her. I swallowed hard, shoving my panic down, and met her gaze with cold defiance. "You really think this will stop me?" I whispered, voice low and firm. She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, darling, you're just too naive. Go ahead, call your father. See if he believes you. Or better yet, explain to him why you carelessly misplaced something so important." My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to breathe. There was no point in confronting her. She'd already won this battle. Or so she thought. I pushed past her, ignoring the taunting laughter that followed. Once I was in the hallway, I wiped the angry tears from my cheeks. In my room, I locked the door and sat on the floor, my mind racing. This wasn't just spite, it was calculated. She wanted to ruin my one chance at freedom. But I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Not now, not ever. Slowly, I pulled out my phone and opened the old photo folder. I had one last hope, a backup plan I'd set in motion months ago, just in case. A whispered prayer slipped from my lips as I confirmed the backup passport was still safely tucked away at a friend's house across town. Standing up, I glanced at the window, dawn light streaming through, and whispered, "You'll see." There was a time when home felt like a sanctuary. The walls were bare, the floors creaked under the weight of every footstep, and the windows rattled in the winter winds. But it was ours. My father worked long hours at the factory, his hands calloused and stained with engine grease. But he always came home with a smile. On good days, he'd bring back fresh bread from the bakery on 5th Street, and we'd sit at the kitchen table with mismatched chairs, tearing pieces of the warm loaf and dipping it in salted butter. Our life wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. I can still remember the smell of his old leather jacket, faint traces of motor oil and pine, a comfort that I would hold on to even when everything else slipped away. Everything changed when she arrived. It was the summer of my 15th year, when my father met her, Vivian. A woman with perfectly styled hair, red nails that glinted like freshly picked cherries, and a smile that stretched too wide. He was smitten almost immediately. I saw the way his eyes sparkled when she laughed, the way he straightened his back and smoothed his hair whenever she came around. It was like watching him peel away layers of himself, trying desperately to fit her polished world. Their wedding was a whirlwind, barely 6 months after their first date. She wore a dress that shimmered with sequins, glittering beneath the stained glass windows of the church. My father's eyes were wet with tears, and I remember feeling guilty for the knot of dread that sat heavy in my stomach. I wanted to be happy for him. I tried. But Vivian's kindness wore thin almost immediately after the honeymoon. Gone were the sweet smiles and careful questions about my schoolwork. She filled the house with heavy perfumes and expensive furniture, replacing my mother's old curtains with velvet drapes that blocked out the sunlight. She would sigh dramatically whenever I entered the room, her eyes sweeping over me like I was something to be fixed or discarded. "Still wearing that old jacket?" she'd ask, her lips curling into a practiced smile. "It smells like a mechanic's workshop." I wore it more often after that. School became my escape. I threw myself into my studies, poring over textbooks late into the night just to avoid the tension at home. My teachers noticed the change. A few even pulled me aside to ask if everything was all right. But what could I say? That my father had fallen for a woman who seemed to resent my very existence. That I felt like a ghost drifting through my own house. When I started bringing home straight A's, I thought maybe she'd soften, but she would only look at my report cards with mild disinterest. "I suppose that's all right," she'd say, barely glancing up from her magazine. My father, though, would beam with pride, his hands heavy on my shoulders as he told me how proud he was. I clung to those moments, small droplets of validation in a desert of indifference. But Vivian was not content with just ignoring me. She whispered things to my father, small, insidious doubts that wormed their way into his mind. "She's always in her room. Are you sure she's studying? She's been distant lately. Maybe she's running with the wrong crowd." He'd confront me sometimes, his voice hesitant but firm, and I would defend myself with fire and desperation, my heart breaking a little more each time I saw that flicker of doubt in his eyes. I realized, slowly and painfully, that she wasn't just ignoring my dreams. She was trying to destroy them. When I got the letter for the scholarship interview, I thought I saw something flash in her eyes. Panic, maybe, or fear. Her smile grew tighter, her comments sharper. "You think a school like that is going to take you?" She'd muse over breakfast, tapping her fingernails against her coffee cup. "It's quite ambitious, don't you think?" I swallowed back the urge to argue, knowing it would only feed her satisfaction. I simply nodded, clutching my acceptance letter closer to my chest, letting her words roll off me like water. But she wasn't finished. She dropped hints to my father. Concerns. About the cost, about the distance, about my maturity to handle such a move. He would nod, brow furrowing as if considering her words. And I would sit there, silently screaming inside, knowing I was watching her twist him further around her polished finger. It became my obsession, my lifeline. I pored over study guides, rehearsed my answers, ironed my dress, and packed my suitcase, a week in advance. I would not give her the satisfaction of watching me fail. The night before the interview, I sat on my bed, looking around my small, cluttered room, my sanctuary. Old photos of my mother smiled back at me from the vanity mirror, her eyes bright and full of life. I ran my fingers over the edge of the frame, whispering a promise to her that I would make it out. That I would become something more than just Vivian's inconvenience. I locked my drawer that night, sliding my passport and interview documents inside before shutting it tight. I even tested the handle twice, ensuring it wouldn't budge. I slept with the key tucked beneath my pillow, my fingers brushing it throughout the night, a talisman against the storm I could feel brewing. I should have known. I should have expected it. Vivian had never let me have anything good without making me pay for it, but I wasn't prepared for just how far she would go. The morning of my interview was supposed to be calm. I had planned everything down to the minute. My outfit was ironed and hung by the door, my shoes polished to a mirror shine. I even laid out my makeup the night before, all neatly arranged, ready for the transformation from invisible to invincible. But when I stepped out of my room, the chaos struck me like a tidal wave. Vivian's voice, sharp and shrill, carried through the hallway, mingling with the clatter of champagne glasses and forced laughter. I reached the landing and looked down. The living room was swarming with women in pearls and wide-brimmed hats, their lips painted in shades of coral and plum. Trays of pastries glittered with sugar, and waiters in white gloves moved gracefully between the guests. "What is this?" I whispered to no one. The stairs creaked beneath me as I descended, heart hammering. Vivian spotted me immediately, her smile stretching wide as she waved me over. Her gown shimmered, emerald green satin that caught the morning light and spilled it across the floor. "Oh, good morning, dear," she called, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I'm hosting a little breakfast for the ladies. I thought it would be uplifting." Her eyes sparkled with unspoken malice. But I swallowed, forcing my voice not to waver. "Today's my interview." Her smile only grew wider. "Oh, sweetheart, I just remembered. Your passport is missing, isn't it?" She pressed her hand to her chest in mock concern. "Maybe you should stay and help me host." Her gaze flicked to the guests who were watching with mild curiosity, their glasses poised mid-sip. The blood drained from my face. "Where is it?" I demanded, louder than I intended. A few heads turned. Vivian's smile never wavered. Now. No need to make a scene," she whispered, stepping closer, her perfume, a cloying blend of jasmine and something bitter, filling my senses. "You wouldn't want my guests thinking you're ungrateful, would you?" I stared at her, the rage simmering beneath my skin, pulsing in my veins. She didn't flinch. She just stared back, calm and poised, a queen in her domain. I wanted to scream, to throw her precious champagne flutes to the ground and watch them shatter. But I knew, deep down, I couldn't. Not here. Not in front of them. I turned away sharply, my breath coming in ragged bursts as I hurried down the hallway. I pulled at the front door, and it didn't budge. I tried again, rattling the handle until I felt the skin of my palms scrape. Locked. Of course it was. I rushed to the windows, each one latched, secured. Panic clawed its way up my throat, its nails scraping against my sanity. I tried the back door, dead-bolted. Vivian's laughter floated in from the living room, a lilting, cruel melody that burrowed under my skin. "You can't keep me here," I shouted, turning back to her. She barely looked up from her conversation, waving her hand dismissively as if shooing away a fly. "Don't be so dramatic, darling. Maybe if you had been more responsible with your things, you wouldn't be in this position." Her friends chuckled, the sound like nails on glass. I felt something snap inside me. I ran upstairs, grabbed my backpack, and shoved in what I could. Papers, pens, my folder of documents. The window in my room was locked, but I knew of one that wasn't. The one in the old guest room that Vivian had stopped using after redecorating. I slipped down the hall, ignoring the chatter and clinks of glass below. The guest room was dusty, the air stale from disuse. I shoved the window open, its hinges groaning in protest, and swung one leg over the sill. The drop was short, the bushes beneath prickly and unwelcoming, but I didn't hesitate. I landed hard, the branches clawing at my legs, scraping my skin. I bit back the sting and ran, not looking back at the house or the towering hedges that bordered the property. I knew where I had to go. I sprinted to the back of the garden, past the fountain that hadn't worked in years, to the corner where the ivy grew thickest. I knelt down, brushing away the overgrowth, my hands shaking as I unearthed the small wooden box I had buried months ago. My fingers fumbled with the latch, dirt caking beneath my nails. When it clicked open, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. There it was, the duplicate passport. I had secured it during a school trip abroad, a fluke opportunity that I had seized with both hands. I had hidden it here as a last resort, a whisper of hope in case Vivian ever crossed the line. I clutched it to my chest, ignoring the dirt smudged across its surface. Without a second thought, I turned and ran. My feet pounded the pavement, my lungs burning with each gasp of cold morning air. The bus stop was just up ahead, its sign swinging slightly in the breeze. I stumbled to the curb just as the bus pulled up, its doors creaking open with a hiss. The driver gave me a once-over, mud-splattered shoes, wild eyes, and torn sleeves, but said nothing. I dropped my coins in the slot and collapsed into the bow near a seat, my breaths ragged and uneven. As the bus pulled away, I looked out the window. The estate shrank behind me, the manicured lawns and stone walls disappearing into the distance. I allowed myself one last glance back, whispering a promise into the glass. You didn't break me. When I arrived at the interview, I was battered, bruised, and breathless. But I was there. I stood in the waiting room, ignoring the curious glances and whispered conversations. When my name was called, I rose with my head held high. I delivered my speech with fire, every word sharpened by spite and desperation. I saw their eyes, wide and unblinking, caught by the rawness of my voice. When I finished, the room was silent, awed. I walked out of that building with my head held high, blood-streaked palms and aching legs, but unbroken. Vivian had tried to destroy me, but I was still here. I was still standing. I left without ceremony. It wasn't as dramatic as I'd imagined it would be. I always thought there would be shouting, maybe tears, some grand revelation where my father would finally see through her carefully constructed lies. But there was none of that. I packed my suitcase in silence, folding my clothes with deliberate care, slipping my scholarship acceptance letter into a side pocket. I had rehearsed the conversation in my head so many times. How I would tell him I was leaving, that I wouldn't be coming back, that this life she had built around him was suffocating me. But when I walked downstairs, suitcase in hand, the words tangled in my throat. My father stood in the kitchen, mug of coffee cradled between his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. I hovered in the doorway, waiting for him to speak. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a long, heavy moment. I saw the flicker of understanding there, like maybe he knew what I was about to do. His mouth opened as if to say something, then closed again. He just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. That was it. No argument, no questions. Just quiet resignation. Vivian was nowhere to be seen. I wondered if she was hiding upstairs, listening from behind a door with a grin stretched across her painted lips. Or maybe she didn't even care enough to watch me go. I pushed the thought away and walked out the front door, letting it close softly behind me. Outside, the morning air was crisp, the kind of clean that only comes after a storm. I walked down the path, suitcase rolling unevenly on the cracked pavement, and for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe. I moved to the city with just enough money for the deposit on a cramped studio apartment. It wasn't much. One window that overlooked an alley, cracked tiles in the kitchen and pipes that groaned with age. But it was mine. For the first few nights I slept on the floor, curled up beneath a blanket, listening to the hum of the city below. It wasn't comfortable, but it was free of her. That was enough. Classes started a week later. I threw myself into my studies, barely coming up for air. I worked part-time at a cafe on the corner, spending my mornings brewing coffee and wiping down tables, and my afternoons buried in textbooks. I didn't mind the long hours. I welcomed them. They kept me busy. They kept me distracted. Loneliness was the hardest part. I didn't know anyone in the city. My classmates were polite, distant. I made small talk with customers, exchanged pleasantries with my professors, but I went home to silence. There were nights when I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the neighbors through paper-thin walls. I could hear their conversations, their arguments, their laughter. I'd close my eyes and imagine myself somewhere else, anywhere but here. But slowly, things began to change. I met Laura at the cafe one rainy afternoon. She ordered a black coffee and sat at the corner table with a stack of notebooks, scribbling furiously between sips. I admired her from behind the counter. How she seemed to exist so freely, her curls bouncing as she laughed at something on her phone, her hands ink-stained from hours of writing. One day she forgot her umbrella, and I caught up to her just as the rain began to pour. She looked at me like she'd seen me for the first time, her eyes bright with surprise. From that day on, we were inseparable. Laura introduced me to her friends, artists, musicians, dreamers who filled their tiny apartments with loud music and cheap wine. We'd spend our nights on rooftops, blankets spread out beneath us as we looked up at the city lights, sharing stories and laughter that echoed off the brick walls. I found myself smiling more, laughing more. My shoulders felt lighter. For the first time, I began to think about my life in terms of what I wanted, not what I was running from. Every few months, I would send a letter back home, addressed to my father. I kept them short, polite. I'd write about school, my classes, the city. I never mentioned Vivian. I'd include small gifts sometimes, pens with the university logo, a scarf I knitted when the winters grew too cold. I never got a response. Not once. At first I thought maybe he hadn't received them, but then I knew. Of course he had. Vivian had seen to it. I pictured her tearing the envelopes open, scanning the words with narrowed eyes before throwing them in the trash. I imagined my father asking if he'd gotten any mail, and her smiling that perfect, practiced smile as she told him no. For a while, I kept sending them anyway. But eventually, I stopped. I stopped waiting. I stopped hoping. I stopped needing his approval like some lifeline tethering me to the girl I used to be. I built a life here. A small one, maybe. But it was mine. I studied hard, made friends, built connections. I found myself becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone untethered from the chains she had tried to wrap around me. It wasn't perfect. Some nights the loneliness crept back in, whispering doubts and fears. But I silenced them with work and determination, carving out a space for myself in a world that she could never touch. I looked around my tiny apartment one night, the city lights flickering outside my window, and I realized I was finally free. Not just free of her, but free of the weight of their expectations. Free of the need to be seen, to be loved by those who couldn't, who wouldn't, acknowledge my worth. It felt like stepping out of a cage, and I wasn't going back. The years that followed were like watching a flower bloom slowly through the cracks of concrete, agonizingly slow, but unstoppable. I poured myself into my studies with a ferocity I hadn't known I possessed. Law school was brutal. Long nights spent hunched over textbooks that felt like they weighed more than I did, lectures that stretched into hours, and exams that clawed at my sanity. but I thrived. I became known for my tenacity, for my refusal to back down. My professors took note, pushing me harder, encouraging me when I thought I couldn't take another step. I was always the last one to leave the library, the lights flickering as I packed up my things, eyes bleary but determined. I wasn't just learning the law, I was mastering it. Every case I read, every loophole I discovered, it felt like peeling back the layers of control that people like Vivian wielded so easily. I imagined her face sometimes as I scribbled notes in the margins, the way she would smirk over her wine glass, thinking she had won. I swore I'd never be that powerless again. Graduation came with more than just a diploma. It came with job offers, opportunities I couldn't have dreamed of back when I was running barefoot through the garden, clutching my backup passport with dirt under my nails. I chose a small firm at first, one that specialized in family law. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. I sat across from women whose stories mirrored my own. Manipulation, financial abuse, control that was slipped into their lives like poison in a glass of wine. I fought for them like I was fighting for myself. Every victory felt like reclaiming a piece of my own dignity. Every woman who walked out of my office with her head held high was a small act of revenge against everything Vivian had tried to steal from me. My reputation grew. I found myself lecturing at universities, speaking to rooms full of bright-eyed students eager to make a difference. I would stand at the podium, my hands steady, my voice clear, and tell them about power, not the kind that is taken, but the kind that is built from the ground up. I watched their eyes light up with hope and fire, and it felt like healing. It was during one of those lectures that I first saw the letter. It was slid beneath my office door, the envelope plain and unmarked. I almost threw it away, assuming it was junk mail or some promotional garbage, but something about the weight of it made me pause. I tore it open and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. My father's, jagged and unsteady. The words blurred together at first, like my mind couldn't quite process them. He asked for forgiveness, scrawled across the page in ink that had smudged slightly, as if his hands had been shaking. He wrote about the mistakes he had made, the things he had allowed to happen under his roof. He mentioned Vivian by name for the first time, not as his wife, but as the woman who had ruined his life. He spoke of tax fraud, of money that had vanished into her private accounts, of accusations of embezzlement that were beginning to surface. He said he was sorry. He said he missed me. He said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again. I read it 3 times before I let the words sink in. My hands were shaking, my breath unsteady. I placed the letter on my desk and stared at it for a long time. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. How she used to smile with that smug tilt of her head. How she used to whisper poison into his ear. The way she had watched me leave with her eyes glittering with satisfaction. I didn't write back. I didn't call. I just waited. Months slipped by. My life continued. I built my practice, expanded my client base, and tried to forget the letter folded away in my desk drawer. But the past has a way of catching up. It was a Thursday morning when I saw it. I was sipping coffee in my apartment, the city sprawled out beneath my window, sunlight pouring in soft and golden. The TV played in the background, the news anchor's voice a hum of static, until I heard her name, Vivian. I turned, my mug frozen halfway to my lips. There she was, her face pale, eyes wide with disbelief as she was led out of her mansion in handcuffs. Flashbulbs popped around her, voices shouting, microphones thrust forward as she stumbled down the marble steps. Her hair, always so perfectly styled, hung limp around her shoulders. She looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken. The anchor's voice cut through the noise. Vivian Cartwright, charged with multiple counts of tax fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct. The investigation suggests years of illicit activity, including fraudulent accounts and unreported income. I sat back slowly, the mug still in my hand, and watched her disappear into the back of the police car. The camera zoomed out, showing the mansion, cold and hollow now, its windows dark. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just watched, letting the image burn into my mind. Then, slowly, I leaned back, a smile curling at the edges of my lips. It wasn't just satisfaction. It was peace. I raised my glass. Red wine, vintage, the kind I used to watch her sip in our living room while she plotted her little games. I took a slow, deliberate sip and let the warmth spread through my chest. The power had shifted. I wasn't the girl, scrambling through the mud anymore, clutching stolen documents and running for a bus. I wasn't the silent shadow at the kitchen table, desperately trying to make my father see the truth. I was free. I was powerful. I was untouchable. I drained the glass, placed it back on the table, and turned off the TV. The silence felt different, now, like the ending of a symphony, lingering and triumphant. I watched the city lights flicker outside my window and whispered to the empty room. Now you know what it feels like to lose. The courthouse loomed ahead, a sprawling fortress of stone and glass, its windows gleaming under the sharp morning sun. I stood on the steps for a moment, my heels grounded firmly against the polished concrete, my breath curling in the crisp air. I smoothed the front of my coat, adjusting the lapels with fingers that barely trembled. This was it. The final chapter. Inside, the walls were painted in muted tones, the ceilings high and vaulted. Voices echoed off marble floors, lawyers, clerks, families huddled in corners with their eyes rimmed red. I walked past them with my head held high, heels clicking in sharp rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. I had spent too long running. Today, I would face her. When I entered the courtroom, I saw her immediately. Vivian sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. She looked smaller, shrunken somehow, as if the weight of her choices had finally begun to compress her spirit. Her hair, once meticulously styled, hung limp. Around her face, streaks of gray threaded through the blonde. She looked up as I took my seat at the front, her eyes meeting mine with a flicker of disbelief. For a moment, her mask of indifference slipped, and I saw it. Fear. It darted across her features before she smoothed it away, her lips curling into a familiar sneer. But it was weaker now, brittle. I met her gaze without flinching, without blinking. I saw her swallow, her eyes darting away. The power shift was palpable. I straightened my back, feeling the years of silence and restraint melt from my shoulders like heavy winter snow. The trial was long and grueling, filled with witness testimonies and evidence that seemed to pile up like debris in a storm. Financial. Records were displayed on screens, the red numbers glaring in digital clarity. Testimonies of employees she had manipulated, friends she had stolen from. Piece by piece, her empire unraveled. My turn came late in the afternoon. I stood when my name was called, smoothing my skirt before stepping forward. I took the oath, my hand steady, my voice clear. The prosecutor began with simple questions. My background, my relationship to the defendant. Can you describe your experience living with Mrs. Vivian Cartwright? I inhaled slowly, letting the memory settle like dust in an old attic. I can, I said, my voice steady. I saw her stiffen at the table, her fingers curling into tight fists. Living with Vivian was like living with velvet over steel. Everything appeared beautiful on the surface, polished, graceful, but there was always something sharp beneath. The room was silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. She manipulated my father. I continued, my voice growing stronger. She isolated me, undermined my ambitions, and attempted to sabotage my opportunities. When I finally left, I thought I would be free of her, but she found ways to linger. I saw Vivian's lawyer whisper something in her ear, but she shook her head slightly, eyes locked on me. I held her gaze, refusing to look away. "Did you witness any financial misconduct during your time living there?" the prosecutor asked. My lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I did," I replied. "I saw her forge signatures. I saw her create accounts in my father's name, accounts he never touched." I paused, watching the color drain from her face. "And I kept records." There was a shuffle of papers, and I saw her lawyer's eyes widen as files were passed to him. Vivian's mask cracked. Her eyes flared wide, her mouth opening slightly as if she couldn't quite catch her breath. For the first time in my life, I saw real fear in her eyes. I spoke for another hour, detailing every manipulation, every deceit. My voice never wavered. When I finished, the room was silent. I stepped down with my chin high, heels clicking sharply, against the polished floor, the echo ringing with a kind of finality. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. I sat in the gallery, hands folded neatly in my lap as the sentence was read. Vivian did not turn to look at me. Her shoulders were hunched, her head bowed slightly, the glitter of her once pristine persona dulled to ash. When the guards came to take her away, she hesitated at the door, turning just slightly, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on mine. I held her gaze, unflinching, my eyes hard as stone. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but I raised my hand slightly, silencing her without a word. I watched as she was led through the double doors, the heavy sound of them closing reverberating, through the room. It was done. Outside the courtroom, I leaned against the marble pillar, letting the chill of it seep into my bones. People filed past me, murmuring quietly, brushing shoulders but never pausing. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the air, sharp and clean like the first breath after a storm. Wait. The voice was faint, strained. I opened my eyes to find my father standing a few steps away, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. He looked older, much older than the last time I'd seen him. His hair had thinned, the lines on his face etched, deeper. His eyes, once bright and confident, were hollowed by years of regret. We stood in silence for a long moment. I searched his face, waiting for him to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Finally, he whispered, "I'm sorry." There were so many things I could have said, so many questions I could have asked. Why hadn't he seen it? Why hadn't he believed me? Why had he let her twist him into something unrecognizable? But none of them mattered anymore. I nodded once, a soft smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "I know." He stepped forward, hesitating just before he reached me. I saw his hand twitch, like he wanted to reach out, but he didn't. Instead, he just whispered, "You look strong." I swallowed, my throat tightening. "I am." He nodded, his eyes shining with something that looked like pride, maybe hope. And then he stepped back. I watched him disappear down the marble hallway, his footsteps soft and unsteady. I walked out of the courthouse with my head held high, heels clicking against the marble, each step an echo of everything I had survived. The sunlight was blinding as I stepped onto the street, but I didn't shield my eyes. I wanted to feel it, every ounce of warmth, every whisper of wind that signaled freedom. I stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, closing my eyes and lifting my face to the sky. It was over. The ghost that had haunted me, that had tried to chain me to the past, had been silenced. When I opened my eyes, the city stretched out before me, alive, breathing, full of possibilities. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, and stepped forward, heels striking the pavement with a purpose. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking back.